On the morning of April 20th, 1914, a tent colony in southern Colorado caught fire. Underneath one of those tents there was a pit, a hole the families had dug themselves to hide in. 13 women and children died in that pit. By the end of the day, 25 people were dead. 11 of them were children. They had been on strike since September. They wanted the 8-hour day and a doctor the company didn't choose. The company answered from the hill above the camp. By evening, the tents were burning. The mine belonged to a company owned by the Rockefeller family. 23 years later, when John D. Rockefeller died, America mourned him like a saint. This is the story of how he bought your memory. Every story about John D. Rockefeller starts in the same place: the pious boy, the ledger, the Baptist church. Nobody starts where it actually starts. It starts with his father. William Avery Rockefeller was born in 1810, and he made his living selling medicine that did not work. He traveled from town to town with bottles of elixir, and he told people they could cure cancer. That was the honest part of his business. He also carried a small slate around his neck. Written on it were the words, "I am deaf and dumb." He was neither. He carried it because a man who cannot hear is a man people talk in front of. He would sit in a room silent, harmless, and listen to farmers explain exactly how much money they had and exactly how desperate they were. Then he would come back as himself and offer them a loan at 12%. To men he already knew could not pay it back. When they defaulted, he took the land. In 1849, he was indicted for rape. He was never tried. He left the county. Neighbors also suspected him of stealing horses. In 1855, he married a woman named Margaret Allen. He was still married to John's mother. He did not divorce her. He simply started a second life under a second name, Dr. William Livingston. And for decades he moved between the two, appearing at home now and then with money nobody could explain, and disappearing again. Later in life, Rockefeller's father would tell a story about how he raised his sons. He said he cheated them every chance he got because he wanted to make them sharp. John D. Rockefeller did not learn business in church. He learned it at home. Here is the strange part. The son became the exact opposite of the father, on the surface. John D. Rockefeller did not drink. He did not gamble. He went to the same Baptist church for most of his life, and he taught Sunday school there. He was quiet to the point of being unsettling. Men who negotiated against him described the silence as the worst part. And he kept a book. He called it Ledger A. Every cent he earned, every cent he spent, every cent he gave away, written down, added up, checked. He kept that book his entire life, and in old age he would show it to visitors like other men show photographs of their children. It is a genuinely admirable habit. It is also worth asking what it was for. Because a ledger is not a diary, a ledger is a weapon. The man who knows his exact cost per barrel down to the fraction of a cent knows something his competitor does not know about his competitor's business. He knows how long that competitor can survive a price war. Rockefeller went into oil refining in Cleveland in the 1860s at the exact moment the industry was chaos. Wells were coming in and drying up. Prices swung wildly. Most refiners were gamblers. He was not a gambler. He was an accountant who had walked into a casino. And here the two halves of the man stop being a contradiction and start being a system. The father taught him what people will do when they are desperate. The ledger taught him exactly when they would get there. The public morality was real. He believed it. He also understood better than almost anyone alive that a reputation for honesty is the cheapest thing a business can buy, and the most valuable thing it can own. He would prove that twice, once with oil, and once much later with something far more important. 1872. The year the modern monopoly was invented. To understand what Rockefeller did, you have to understand one boring thing. In the oil business of the 1870s, the product was not the hard part. Anybody could refine oil. The hard part was moving it. Oil came out of the ground in western Pennsylvania. The customers were everywhere else. Between those two facts sat the railroads. Everybody knew the railroads gave discounts to big shippers. That was ugly, but it was normal. Ship more, pay less. That is not what Rockefeller negotiated. In 1872, a company was created called the South Improvement Company. On paper, it was a partnership between a handful of refiners and the railroads. In practice, it was Rockefeller's instrument. The deal had two halves. The first half was the discount. Rockefeller's oil would ship cheaper. Fine. The second half is the one people still do not quite believe when they hear it. Under the arrangement, when a rival refiner shipped a barrel of oil on those railroads and paid the full published rate, the railroad would take a portion of that payment and hand it to Rockefeller. They called it a drawback. Read it again slowly because the shape of it matters. His competitors were not merely paying more than he was. His competitors were paying him. Every barrel a rival sold in the ordinary course of trying to stay alive sent money to the man trying to kill him. He was not competing with them. He was charging them rent on the right to exist. And here is the detail that tells you he understood exactly what he had built. The arrangement was secret. It was supposed to stay secret. It did not. Word leaked into the oil region within weeks, and the reaction was not a lawsuit. It was closer to an uprising. Producers marched. Barrels were destroyed. The railroads panicked and canceled the deal, and the South Improvement Company was dead within months, having never legally shipped a barrel under its charter. Which is the part that gets misread. Because the scheme did not need to survive. In the weeks the threat was live, Rockefeller went to the other refiners in Cleveland, his neighbors, men he knew, and he made them an offer. Sell to me now at my price, or find out what happens next. Most of them sold. He would spend the next 30 years being asked about it, and for 30 years he gave the same answer. He had saved them. He had brought order to a ruinous industry. He had rescued men from their own bad business. And the remarkable thing, the thing you have to sit with one, is that he appears to have genuinely believed it. Cleveland was one city. What happened over the next 30 years was something else, and it is the part that usually gets summarized in a single sentence. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of the refining capacity of the United States. 90% is not a market share, 90% is a weather system. So how do you hold that? Because holding it is harder than getting it. Every year, somewhere in the country, a man with money and nerve decides to build a refinery and take a piece. Rockefeller had an answer for that man. Several. The first was information. Standard Oil paid for it. Clerks in railroad freight offices, telegraph operators, shipping agents, people who saw the paperwork of everybody's business, not just Standard's. Which meant that when an independent refiner in some small city loaded a shipment for a buyer 3 states away, Standard Oil could know about it, the route, the volume, the customer's name. Think about what that actually gives you. It is not just knowing the competitor exists, it is knowing exactly who is buying from him. The second was the price. Once you know the customer, you go to the customer, and you offer him oil below what it costs you to make it. You lose money on that town, deliberately for as long as it takes. Because you are not losing money everywhere. You are losing it in one place, funded by the 90% of the country where you set the price. Your competitor is losing it in the only place he has. He goes under in a season, then the price goes back up. Not to what it was, to whatever the town will now pay, because the town no longer has a choice. And the third was the mask. Some of the companies competing with Standard Oil were not competing with Standard Oil. They looked independent. Different name on the sign, different name on the invoice, local men running them. A customer who was tired of Standard, who deliberately went looking for an alternative, could find one and buy from a company Standard quietly owned. That is the detail that tells you the whole thing was designed by someone who thought several moves ahead. He did not only want the market, he wanted the appearance of a market. Now, each of these tactics was known. Angry men had been describing them for years, in newspapers and in state hearings. The problem was that a competitor who has just been destroyed is, by definition, a bitter loser, and a bitter loser is easy to dismiss. Every accusation against Standard Oil had a built-in defense, and Rockefeller never even had to say it out loud. It said itself. Of course he says that. He lost. For 30 years, that defense held. It held because nobody had ever put the accusation and the paperwork side by side, in order, in public, in a way that a person who had never seen an oil derrick could follow. It would take someone with no business in the industry at all. Someone who was not a bitter loser. Just the daughter of one. Every empire has a witness it does not notice. In the oil region, in a town called Titusville, there was an independent producer named Franklin Tarbell. He was not important, that is the point. He was one of hundreds of small men who had come to the valley when the oil came in, built a business out of wooden tanks and borrowed money and made a living. When the South Improvement Scheme leaked, Franklin Tarbell was one of the men who marched. And when it was over, when the deal was dead and the great victory had been won, he watched his business slowly stop working anyway. The freight rates never went back. The buyers dried up. His partner went into debt and Franklin mortgaged the family home to cover it. He did not lose everything in a dramatic afternoon. He lost it the way most people lose things, gradually and then completely. He had a daughter. She was 14 years old that year. Her name was Ida. She grew up in a house where the word Standard was not the name of a company. It was the name of the thing that had come for her father, She was clever and she got out. She was one of the only women in her college class. She became a writer, went to Paris, wrote biographies, and built a serious career on subjects that had nothing to do with oil. For almost 30 years, she left it alone. Her father, when he heard what she was finally planning to do, told her not to. He told her they would ruin the magazine, that they had ways of reaching people, that she did not understand what she was walking into. He was not being cowardly. He had watched it happen to a whole valley of men. She did it anyway. In November of 1902, McClure's magazine published the first installment of a series called The History of the Standard Oil Company. It ran for 19 installments. 19. Remember that number? It is going to come back. Now, the reason this worked, and the reason it still matters, has almost nothing to do with outrage. There was already plenty of outrage. There had been furious editorials about Standard Oil for 30 years. Rockefeller had absorbed all of it without losing a night's sleep, because furious editorials are opinions, and opinions can be answered with other opinions. Tarbell did not write opinions. She wrote an audit. She went into court records from state investigations. She read testimony under oath. She collected internal documents that had surfaced in litigation. She interviewed men who had sold out and men who had refused. She built the freight rates. She reconstructed the deals. And then she got lucky, in the way that only people who have already done the work get lucky. In a Standard Oil office, there was a teenage clerk whose job that day was to burn a stack of papers. Before he burned them, he looked at them, and on one of the pages he saw a name he recognized. It was his Sunday school teacher. The man was an independent refiner, and the papers the boy had been told to destroy were internal instructions about him, orders to intercept his shipments and take his customers, the freight information coming, as it always did, from inside the railroads. The boy did not burn them. He took them to his teacher. His teacher took them to Tarbell. Sit with the symmetry for a second. Rockefeller taught Sunday school for most of his adult life. It was not a pose, he meant it. And the thing that finally put the machinery of his company on the public record came out of a Sunday school class, carried by a boy who had been raised to believe the things Rockefeller himself taught. The empire was not betrayed by an enemy. It was betrayed by its own morality, showing up on time. And then she laid it out in order with dates and let the documents talk. This is the thing that made her dangerous, and it is worth being precise about it. She was not neutral. Her father had been destroyed by this company. She knew exactly what she was doing. But she never once had to lie because she did not need to. The record was enough. Standard Oil's response is the most revealing part of the whole episode. They did not sue her. A company that size accused in a national magazine over 19 months of secret railroad conspiracies and industrial espionage and driving competitors out of business. And it did not go to court. Because in court you have discovery. In court the documents come out. They knew what the documents said. She had already read them. So instead, they did what they knew how to do. Rockefeller's people privately called her unbalanced. They spread the idea that she was a hysterical woman with a grudge. which had the disadvantage of being half true and the disadvantage of not mattering, because the grudge was in her family and the evidence was in the footnotes. Rockefeller himself in public said nothing at all. For years. His silence had always worked before. Silence is what you do when the story will pass. It did not pass. The series became a book in 1904. The book did what the series had done, but permanently and to people who did not read magazines. And something shifted that had never shifted before. For 30 years, everyone knew Standard Oil was ruthless. After Tarbell, everyone could cite it. The difference between those two states is the difference between a rumor and a case. Public anger turned into political appetite. Political appetite turned into federal action. In 1906, the government sued on. Now step back and look at the shape of this, because this is what this channel is actually about. Rockefeller had defeated competitors. He had defeated producers, refiners, railroads, state legislatures, and the entire oil region of Pennsylvania. He was brought down by a woman with a library card and 30 years of patience. The empire was built on paper. Contracts, rebates, freight bills, ledgers. And it was taken apart by paper, court records, testimony, footnotes, 19 installments in a magazine. He lost that fight, which raises the only question that matters. If he lost, why is he remembered as a philanthropist and she is remembered by almost nobody? To answer that, we have to leave oil entirely. By 1914, the old man had been formally retired for years. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., ran the family's holdings from an office in New York. One of those holdings was a coal and steel company in Colorado. The men who dug that coal did not live in towns. They lived in company camps and company houses and were often paid in company money that could only be spent in the company store. In September of 1913, they went on strike. They were asking for the 8-hour day, for the right to be paid honestly for the coal they dug, for the right to see a doctor who was not chosen by the company, and for the union to be recognized. The company refused to negotiate. Because the houses belonged to the company, going on strike meant being evicted. So 1,200 people, miners, their wives, their children, moved out onto the open prairie and set up a colony of tents. They spent the winter there. They dug pits under the tent floors to shelter in. On the morning of April 20th, 1914, the Colorado National Guard and Company Guards took up positions above the colony. There was gunfire through the day. Accounts differ on who fired first. They do not differ on what happened after. By evening, the tents were burning. Under one of them was a pit where 2 women and 11 children had gone to hide from the shooting. They did not get out. 25 people died at Ludlow. 11 of them were children. The country reacted the way you would expect a country to react. Protesters stood outside the Rockefeller offices in New York, outside the family estate. Newspapers that had spent a decade calling Rockefeller a monopolist now had a word with more weight behind it. For the first time, the family faced something money could not simply outlast. They were not facing a competitor. They were facing the public. So they went out and hired a man to handle it. And that decision, not the oil, not the drawbacks, not Ludlow itself, is the thing that reaches all the way into the room you are sitting in right now. In December of 1914, the Rockefellers hired a former newspaper reporter named Ivy Lee. You have never heard of him. He is, by broad agreement, the father of modern public relations. Not a founder, the father. The industry that exists today, the crisis statement, the press release, the carefully humanizing photograph of the chief executive, is substantially his invention, and Ludlow is where he proved it worked. His campaign had 3 parts. Part 1. He wrote a series of bulletins and sent them to opinion leaders, editors, clergymen, professors, the people who tell other people what to think. There were 19 of them. 19 bulletins against 19 installments. The bulletins contained information about the strike, the militia's conduct, and the deaths that was misleading and, in places, simply inaccurate. That is not a characterization. That is the finding of the historians who went back and checked them against the record. Part 2. Lee took a shy, awkward, deeply private man, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and sent him to Colorado. Not to give a speech, to go down into the mine, to sit in the camps, to listen to grievances, to attend a dance in the miners' hall and dance with the miners' wives. All of it photographed. Now, the reforms that followed were real. Conditions did improve. That is not nothing, and pretending otherwise would be the same sin Lee committed in the other direction. But understand what was purchased. The story stopped being 25 people died in a camp owned by the richest family in America. The story became the heir went to Colorado and listened. Part 3 is the one that won it. Lee opened the old man's private life to the newsreel cameras, Rockefeller on the lawn, Rockefeller playing golf, Rockefeller with his grandchildren, and Rockefeller handing out dimes. 10-cent coins to children, on camera, over and over for years until it became the single most widely known fact about the wealthiest man in the world. By the time he died in 1937, it was said that more people remembered Rockefeller's dimes than remembered the massacre. That sentence is not a metaphor. It is a performance review. One more thing, and it is the part that makes people angriest, because it is the part that is simply arithmetic. On the 15th of May, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken apart into 34 separate companies. This was the great victory, the thing Tarbell's 19 installments had set in motion. The moment the Republic proved it was bigger than any one man. Here is what actually happened. Rockefeller owned more than a quarter of Standard Oil. When it was cut into 34 pieces, he did not lose his quarter. He received his proportional share of every single one of them. And the pieces freed from the holding company turned out to be worth far more apart than together. The market repriced them almost immediately. Some of them would eventually become ExxonMobil, Chevron, Amoco. At the time of the ruling, he was worth somewhere around $300 million. By the end of 1913, 2.5 years later, he was worth over $900 million. The government broke up his empire and it tripled his fortune. Theodore Roosevelt, who had spent his political life fighting exactly this, watched it happen and said it better than anyone since. No wonder that Wall Street's prayer now is, "Oh, merciful Providence, give us another dissolution." So Ida Tarbell won. The courts won. The public won. The law worked exactly as it was designed to work. And the man they were all fighting walked out of it 3 times richer, and 20 years later was remembered as a nice old gentleman who gave coins to children. Which brings us to a quote. If you have ever seen Rockefeller's name on the internet, you have seen it. I don't want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers. He never said it. There is no primary source, no speech, no letter, no contemporaneous account. Snopes went looking and found nothing. The oldest traceable appearance is a conspiracy documentary from 2006. And that is the ending because look at what it means. Millions of people feel correctly that something was taken from them by men like this. They reach for evidence, and the evidence they reach for is fake. They do not reach for the drawbacks, where competitors were made to pay him for the right to trade. They do not reach for Ludlow, where 11 children died in a pit. They do not reach for 19 bulletins written to make that softer. Those things are documented. Those things are worse. The oil monopoly was broken in 1911. The other one never was. Rule number 2 of paper empires: a monopoly on a product can be broken. A monopoly on the story cannot. The fact that you had to be told all of this, the fact that you knew the dimes before you knew the pit, that is not an accident of history. That is the product, still working 110 years later. Next time on Paper Empires, the myths about this man and why every single one of them is weaker than the truth. Sources and archival credits are in the pinned comment.